welcome to the Dish Pig, where we go on a journey of discovery in the food and booze world. I'm your host, Nick Sherry. Aaron Drake from LA on the opening track. I love it. Good stuff, mate. Pretty cold this week in Melbourne. Lots of rain, which means lots of soup. Just had some beef and barley soup my mum whipped up. Bloody delicious. If you have a soup recipe that you'd like to share, send us an email at ask@dishpigpodcast.com, or you can flick us a message on Instagram at _dish_pig. Now, what a week. I am pumped to share this week's chat with you because I personally found it rather inspiring. You see, at some stage in our lives, we come to a crossroads. You either roll over and die, or you pivot, you move forward and you thrive. And that is what this week's guest did with her life. She's bloody smart, unique, and the attention to detail that she puts into her work is incredible. So on a rainy Monday morning, I went on premise to pastry heaven as her staff and customers were in action around us. This is Kate Reid of Lune. Well, Kate.
Hi.
Thank you for being here.
Thanks for being here yourself at Lune.
It's we should say that we are in Lune at the moment. It's a pretty busy Monday morning.
Yeah, it's very busy for a Monday morning, considering yesterday was Mother's Day, which is one of our biggest days of the year. We typically see a bit of drop-off the following day after a huge day, but I think everyone's just in the mood for pastry. It's pretty miserable out there, and coffee and a hot pastry is often the ticket for a day like this in Melbourne.
On a very dreary, grey Monday morning.
Yep.
Now, I usually start by asking our guests what was the last thing they cooked for themselves, but I think in your case it can't be a pastry-related item, so I need to ask, what was the last thing you cooked for yourself that wasn't a pastry?
Completely honestly. Last night I had IKEA meatballs for dinner.
Fantastic.
Yep.
I've had those meatballs.
They're really good.
They're actually not bad.
And then we made Paris mash. And
what's in Paris mash compared to like a regular? Is that the one you put through like a sieve and
it's 1 part potato, 4 parts milk, cream, and butter. So
lovely.
Yeah, there's only a hint of potato in it, but it's delicious. And then braised red cabbage, with balsamic vinegar, and char-grilled broccolini on the barbecue. That was dinner last night.
Hang on, so you're telling me you went and got the meatballs and then all the sides you prepared at home?
Yep.
That's genius.
Well, I was at IKEA yesterday actually buying some extra roasting trays, and I've never had them before, so we decided to buy them, and I was dubious, but I shouldn't have been because they were excellent.
Now, I actually had the only time I've had the meatballs from IKEA was actually in Sweden. So I was at the source in a way, and I was in Gothenburg and had the meatballs there, just as delicious.
Can I ask you a question? Were they a bit caramelised on the outside or not? Because these ones weren't.
Yeah, no, they looked a bit dreary.
Okay,
they did look a bit dreary.
As well.
They still had the taste, but they were a bit. It's almost like a greyish colour, I think, from memory.
And did you get the greyish coloured sauce with them?
Yeah, plenty of that.
Yeah.
And they do it with it's like a cranberry little sauce on it as well, isn't it?
There is, but I made the mistake of not picking that up.
Oh,
so
okay.
I didn't have the full IKEA experience. So I'm going to have to get over to Gothenburg, obviously.
Yeah, or there's always next week.
Well, that's true.
There's always next week. That's a fantastic dinner.
It's pretty basic.
Yeah.
Yep.
Well, we should probably kind of venture back to when you were a child. No. But I mean, I made sure to not do too much research on you.
Oh, I like that.
Because, is it safe to say that when you were growing up, the dream wasn't to open up a bakery and make croissants? Is it pretty safe to say that?
Couldn't have been further from it. Absolutely. Don't get me wrong, I actually have always loved baking. My mum is a fantastic at-home baker.
Oh, okay.
And I used to really enjoy helping her out in the kitchen when she'd bake on a Saturday or Sunday. But it was certainly not the career dream. So
right.
career dream was the opposite end of the spectrum. I was strong technically at school, and I had a real love for motorsport through my father.
Wow. Okay. Yeah.
Yep. So if we want to go back before I was a twinkle in my mum's eye, Dad raced Formula V, which is an accessible form of open wheel motor racing, and he was racing the cars while Mum was pregnant with me. So Mum has a bit of a theory that maybe it was the sound or the smell of petrol or something that first got to me when she was pregnant with me.
Right.
But the love for it continued as I grew up as a little kid, and one of my favourite things was watching Formula One with Dad on a Sunday night when the circus would sort of travel around the world to all the different tracks, and it was my treat to get to stay up late with him and watch the races, and I just loved it.
Did you watch the race last night? It was a Spanish Grand Prix, right?
I didn't.
You didn't?
I think last year with COVID, with the disruption of, obviously they didn't race for the first half of the year, and then when they came back and they were doing the multiple tracks, I'd just gotten out of the habit of it.
Right.
And even though I don't get up super early to bake these days, I do get up early to walk my dog every morning.
Okay.
So I'm a little bit of a go to bed early old person now.
Nothing wrong with that. But so this racing, this is here in Melbourne, Victoria,
Yep. So it was before the Grand Prix came to Melbourne.
Okay, yep.
So I'd watch it while, I remember I was so jealous. He'd go over to Adelaide every year to watch the Grand Prix with his brother, who lives over there. And I was so jealous that he'd go and not take me. But then in 1996, they moved the race to Melbourne, and Dad bought tickets for my brother and I on the Friday. So it wasn't even the race day, it was like practice day one. And I remember that first sensation of showing up at the track and hearing this high-pitched squeal of the cars.
Yeah.
It was almost unhuman, the sound of them. How can something mechanical make a sound like this? And then to catch first sight of them, I think it was on Brocky's Hill, which is this big sweeping bend that goes around Albert Park Lake, and they hit about 300 kilometres an hour. And blink and you miss it. And I'd been watching them on the TV my whole life, which actually gives me such an appreciation for camera work at the races that, photographers and cameramen that are able to capture these things that just travel so incredibly fast. But just getting down there and having this deep appreciation for whatever technical development had gone into these cars, and the smell of the petrol, every sense was just stimulated. And from that day, I just knew that I wanted to work in Formula One, and it was Formula One or nothing. I wasn't interested in a class that was lower than F1.
Just it's either the top or
Correct.
Just not bother.
Yep.
Because the sound of those cars. I remember growing up in Melbourne. Especially during they were practicing throughout the week and leading up to the weekend, and you could hear them all around town. Especially if you're in the inner suburbs.
Yep.
It's just crazy loud when you think about it.
Well, I grew up in Glen Iris, which is sort of 10k from the track.
Oh, okay.
And on a clear day, you could hear them warming up and practicing, and it just blows my mind that sound could travel so far. So, there's got to be something pretty insanely magical about what's gone into the development of something that does that. So it just captured me.
So that was that was the bug. So after your dad was involved, you grew up with it, you get exposed to it. You're now set off on the course of I'm going to work in F1 or nothing else.
I wanted to be a driver first.
Wow.
Yep.
Fantastic.
So
yeah.
I told Dad this, and he's like, that's cool. If you want to be an F1 driver, you start in go-karts. And if you want to learn how to race go-karts, you've got to get a job and go out and earn some money and buy yourself a go-kart because it's an expensive sport. So I did that.
Yep.
Saved up my pennies on some sort of a supermarket job or a paper round or something. But I was really quick in the go-kart, and Dad and I would go out there sort of any night after school that I was able to. I'd convince him to take me out to the track and practice. And it was me going around the track by myself, perfecting every corner, trying to save half a second here and there.
Yeah.
And then I still remember the day of my first race, and I was really nervous about it because, it's one thing driving around by yourself, but I'd seen some of the races and they're pretty hair raising. These guys are cowboys.
Yeah.
And the race that went before me, at the end of the straight of the track that I was a member at, there was a hairpin corner and no runoff area. And one guy's brakes had failed and his go-kart had slid into the kiddie litter, this tiny little runoff area, and then flipped, and he'd
Oh, shit.
been thrown out of the cart, and he was hanging from the fly wire fence.
Oh, my
And
God.
I looked at Dad, and Dad's like, get in the go-kart. I'm like, I wasn't good. Although I was quick by myself, I just didn't have that competitive aggression against other people. And I think it's a trait that's followed me through in life. Like, I never compete against anyone else. I always just compete against myself. I always just try to be better than what I was the day before or what I was the last time I did something. So,
How many were in the race?
oh, probably 15.
Do you remember where you placed?
Oh, I think probably last or second last. I think life preservation became more important, and there's no love lost on the go-kart track. Like, people, it is argy-bargy. Like, people will just bump you off the track, and I was terrified.
Yeah. And was that, I mean, did you keep racing after that? Like, was it, did you kind of keep developing it, or did you kind of just,
I think I
still had
probably
the passion,
competed in a few more races and saw that I was missing some, like, it wasn't a skill that I was missing, it was a trait in myself. Like, I could drive the go-kart, and I knew the racing line, and I knew how to maximise the technical ability out of the go-kart, but I just didn't have that, like, animal aggression to like barge past people, or maybe the confidence, I'm not sure, or a combination of.
Well, I mean, it seems to be like, anyone that's doing that sport, like it's this, there's something inside them that, I don't know if it's like there's no fear factor, or there's something else that's there where it's like
totally
it takes them to that next it just takes them to that next level.
Yep. And I think, like, probably like anyone, given enough time at the wheel, and everyone has the ability to learn the technical skill to drive well.
Right.
But it's that X factor that, like, not everyone in the world can be a Formula One driver.
Yeah.
So I learnt that pretty early on, and I guess knowing that I was really strong in technical subjects at school, and, like, I enjoyed maths and physics and science. So, like, reaching back to that first day that I went to the track at Albert Park and had a deep appreciation for the technical development of the cars, I thought, well, maybe instead of driving, I can still work in this incredible industry, and maybe I can be part of designing these cars. So I reckon I was about 14 or 15 when I made that decision that I wanted to do that.
And how? I mean, because it's a pretty specific thing that you're kind of committing to trying to break into professionally. But if someone, like, if you're a young kid and you're growing up and you want to say, I want to design F1 cars.
Yep.
I mean, all the subjects at uni and that aside, but, like, do you get into it are you part of a specific part of the car, or or is there a specific part of the team that you focus on, or is it just the overall car itself? Like, how does that even work?
So when I was 14 or 15 and decided I wanted to be part of designing the car, I didn't have a clear vision then, but as I went through in my studies, and specifically when I got to university, so when I was 14, I went along to RMIT's Career Open Day, and I told them what I wanted to do, and they said, look, you could study mechanical or automotive engineering, but if you want to give yourself the best opportunity, we'd recommend you study aerospace engineering, because it encompasses all of mechanical and automotive, but it goes far deeper into the science of how a Formula One car works from an automotive perspective. So I got into aero, and I just discovered this absolute love for aerodynamics. So it wasn't until I got to university that I really started to hone in on what I wanted to specialise in. And it was like my final year honours thesis was related to aerodynamics. So I designed, I had an idea for redesigning the end plates on the rear wing of a Formula One car or an open wheel racing car. So
what part's that? Sorry, the rear what?
So the rear wing has end plates.
Yeah.
And I had,
on that. Okay. Yeah. Right and left side. Bang. Yeah.
Books that bookend each end of the wing.
Yeah.
And I had an idea to redesign them to improve the aerodynamic airflow, not only around the end plates but also at the ends of the wing.
Okay.
To sort of maximise downforce for the entire length of the wing. And then I did wind tunnel testing, both flow visualisation and measuring the downforce and the drag.
Yeah.
So I'd become quite specific in my area of interest already during university. And then when I got into Formula One, it was as an aerodynamicist. And I was when I got a job at Williams, I was working on the front end aerodynamics team.
Got it. Okay.
That was front wing, front wing end plates, air inlet, front brake ducts, nose cone, etc.
Yeah.
So our little team of 4 focused specifically on ongoing development of that area of the car.
And how? I mean, jumping straight from so you went straight from university to working for Williams. Like, how did you even?
No, I had 1 year where I worked at Ford Australia.
Okay.
But I'd applied to do a master's in motorsport engineering at Cranfield University in the UK, and that's a course that takes, I think, about 10 people a year. It's really hard to get into, and it's funded by the Formula One teams, and it's pretty much a golden ticket into F1.
Right,
so
okay.
you go and you do this, I think it was 18 months or 2 years, this master's, and once you've done it, you're given a job in an F1 team.
Right.
So I'd applied for that, and I'd been accepted and offered a place. And then I thought, it'd be really great to try and get some experience in a Formula One team before I go and do the course. So I started writing letters to every F1 team, and then I did come down the tiers because I thought, it'd even be great to get experience in a Formula 3 or 3000 or even a European Formula Ford team, just to have experience before I start the course. And I heard back from one team, and it was Williams F1, which is the team that was my dream team that I wanted to work for.
Oh, wow.
And they said, we've actually got an opening for a junior aerodynamicist. Can we interview you for the role? And it was only when I actually ended up at Williams that I realised how incredibly lucky that my letter landed on their desk that particular day, because I think they received something like 3,000 applications a week.
3,000 a week?
Yep. And, I mean, that's what a needle in a haystack.
Yeah.
And I didn't really have any experience. I was fresh out of university working at Ford Australia, and I don't know what made my letter stand out. It wasn't even an application for an advertised job. It was, can I come and do work experience with you guys? But I have a feeling it was probably linked to Cranfield University because I'd already been through the very strenuous application process there. So they knew you were going there regardless. So they're like, maybe we'll just swoop you up and get you early, basically. Yep. And then I think 3 or 4 months in, a few of the engineers in the department took me aside and said, there's absolutely no point you doing the course because you're already working in Formula One. So I circumnavigated the Masters, didn't need to do that, and just got myself a job straight in F1, which I think 1 year out of uni is incredibly lucky.
Unbelievable. I've been watching Drive to Survive on Netflix.
Oh, how good is it?
And the access they get is just, it's crazy. It's such a good insight into that sport because, I mean, I definitely didn't grow up following it in any way and knowing too much, outside who maybe the top 2 drivers were. But when you're kind of, in the thick of it, meeting all the team principals and the engineers and this and that and all the, the issues that go on behind the scenes. Because I think, Williams now, they're kind of struggling, right?
Oh, big time. Yeah. I think that series has done a lot for Formula One, just making it more accessible for people that didn't think they were interested in motorsport. And I think even if you don't want to watch the races, it's such a good series. Like, you meet all the characters and, the animosity between the different drivers and teams and all of the drama that goes on behind. Like, it's actually true. And it's amazing how accurately they've portrayed the world of F1. I think it's one of the best things to happen to F1 in a long time, that series being produced. It's pretty,
I watched it with my wife as well, and, we're a couple of seasons, I think we watched the first 2 seasons of the 2018 and 2019 F1 season, but, these races have been, they're over, they're run, but even when they're, portraying it in the show, you're like, oh shit, like, if they're tracking a driver, and it's still pretty tense, so they've made it really well.
Well, they've, I guess, cut to the most exciting bits too, so it's the best way to watch it. Not all those laps of people just following each other around. Like, is someone going to make an overtaking maneuver?
Yeah. So, okay, so you're at Williams. You're how old are you at this stage?
24.
So you're 24. You're at Williams in the UK. You're in your dream job.
Yep.
What happens from here?
So pretty early on at Williams, I became quite frustrated in the work, and it wasn't like, Williams was a wonderful company to work for. Like, we had state-of-the-art facilities in terms of the aerodynamics department. We had a 60% scale wind tunnel and a full-scale rolling road where we could put the whole race car in and get really accurate testing.
Is that so? That's when you drop the car on the and then
like wheel tethers hold it on there. Right. So because a static car where the wheels aren't moving doesn't, like, the wheels moving changes the airflow over the car so much that if you're not depicting that, then any results that you've got from sort of the wheels back aren't going to be as accurate as you need it to be to reflect what actually happens on the track. But we had fantastic resources there. But at the time, like, Williams has a wonderful history in F1. Like, you know, they've won world championships, drivers and constructors. They're one of sort of the heralded original teams, and it's amazing that they're still running as like a family-owned team. But it was, I think they weren't winning at the time that I was there. Like, they were paid probably mid-pack, and there was this, they weren't used to being mid-pack. They were used to being the winning team or at the front of the grid. And there was a fairly negative atmosphere in the office, like this panic to be back at the front. And I think because of that negative attitude, it kind of cascaded down onto the engineers. Like, it wasn't positive. I thought I was going to go work in Formula One and be in the most inspiring environment. Like, it's a privilege to get to design something that's not necessarily changing the world. It's an awful lot of fun and really push the boundaries of what's possible with that technology and think outside the box. But by the time I got there, we were chasing the lead teams. And when you're chasing rather than leading, it's a very defensive way to run a business. And I didn't feel like we were coming up with exciting new ideas. I felt like we were chasing what other people were doing.
Right.
And there was a lot of pressure. There wasn't a good social atmosphere in the office. Like, you weren't really encouraged to talk. So you just get there, and for 16 hours a day, it was head down, bum up on your computer. And, I mean, I'm sure everyone can tell by now I love to have a chat. So it started to affect me a little bit that it wasn't a really collaborative environment. And at the time, another F1 team, a smaller one, which was the original Jordan F1 team, they were looking for an aerodynamicist at more of an entry level where I was, and they approached me and asked if I'd be interested to move teams. And some of the engineers in the office recommended that it might be a good idea because I might get to learn more. And at a smaller team, you're responsible for more. And so I took that advice. So I was at Williams for about a year, and then I moved to what was Force India at the time.
Oh, okay,
and the atmosphere in that office was probably 10 times worse than Williams, and it ended up personally being a bad move for me. And maybe if I had been a different personality, it might have worked. But
were they in the UK as well? Or
okay.
Like,
there's this belt around like the northwest of London, sort of from Oxford all the way through up to Milton Keynes, and the majority of F1 teams are based in that little section there.
Oh, right. Okay.
And then you've obviously got Ferrari and a couple of other teams that are outside of the UK, but there's a cluster of them there. So I moved to a team that was based in Brackley, which was about 45 minutes north of where I'd been at Williams.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. And I think moving to that team, I just became very depressed, like clinically depressed. And the clinical depression ended up turning into a very bad eating disorder.
Oh, okay.
So
right.
I got really sick with anorexia. And so probably about 2.5, 3 years after moving to the UK, my boyfriend at the time called my parents, and he was at his wit's end. Like, it was far too much for him and me to manage.
Yeah.
And he worked in F1 as well. And like, we were both working long hours, and I wasn't getting better. He just called mum and dad and said, I don't know what to do anymore. So dad jumped on a plane, and within 48 hours was in the UK, packed up my life and brought me home.
Wow.
So that was the end of F1.
Yeah.
And to be honest, I couldn't have been happier to be half the way around the world from it.
I was going to say, like, you know, the feeling of being, you know, removed from it, it was just a huge weight off the shoulders, and like you needed someone to come in and kind of pull you out.
Yeah, I think I'm an incredibly stubborn person, and had I not developed the eating disorder, I think I probably would have, like, the stubborn side of me and the pride would have pushed me to prove to myself that all of that hard work to get there was worth it, and I might have stayed there and been incredibly unhappy. But kind of, like, I certainly don't want to celebrate an eating disorder, but having to completely start from scratch again because I had no other choice might have been the best thing that could have possibly happened to me, because when I got back to Australia, my family doctor told mum and dad that had I not come back, I had about 6 weeks left to live.
God.
Yeah. It's pretty crazy.
Wow.
So I had no other choice.
Yeah.
And one of the funny things about an eating disorder is because you're starving yourself, your body is just sending signals to your brain all day telling you to eat. Like, I'm starving, put food in me, I need nutrition, I need fuel. So all you can think about all day is food, which is torture because it's the one thing that you're trying to restrict and limit and not do, but it's all you can think about. So even when I was still in the UK, instead of eating it, I started to live vicariously through the planning, preparation and watching other people eat it.
Okay.
And the most forbidden of foods is baked goods because, like, you know, they're naughty or, like, you know, the quote unquote naughty. Like, I now believe nothing is naughty. Like, everything is fine in moderation. Like, we just eat a balanced diet and that includes baked goods. But I became really passionate about making things for everyone in the office. So I'd sit in the office and instead of doing my work, I'd think about what I could bake at night or make for dinner. And then I'd plan what ingredients I needed and I'd go to specialty shops to get them. And then I'd go home and you'd start with this, like, you know, 8 or 10 raw ingredients on your bench that by themselves, they're nothing, like flour or salt or sugar or butter, but bring them together and you can, like, through science and magic, you can make something that makes your kitchen smell incredible and it can bring a real smile to people's faces. So I started to develop a real love for food and cooking, ironically, through the eating disorder.
That's so interesting. I mean, it's from that point, when did the decision kind of, you know, when did you know that, okay, I'm kind of onto something here? I've been channeling this energy. You know, you're back in Australia. You're on this kind of, a path of recovery, like a new path. At what stage did you think I'm actually going to take this to the next level? And I mean, you know, did you take yourself off for? I mean, did you train for this? Did you do a lot of research? Like, how did that kind of start the path towards Lune?
So the day that I landed back in Australia, when my dad brought me home, I looked in the local paper and Philippa's Bakery in Armidale were advertising for a casual front of house staff member. And I thought, like, essentially with Formula One, since, you know, a very young age, I'd decided exactly what I wanted, and what ensued was years worth of commitment to study and building up the experience to get there. And I was terrified about going down that path again, only to discover that the dream that I had at the end wasn't what wasn't what I wanted. So instead of committing to, you know, 4 years of patisserie school or a 4-year apprenticeship, I thought, how about I just get a job front of house at a bakery and see if I like the environment.
Yeah.
It would have been like getting a part-time job at a Formula One team when I was 15 and going like, do I actually like this? That's not really possible. Yeah. But maybe unless you're like Frank Williams' granddaughter. So I got a job and, like, I was so unwell. I don't know where I actually found the energy to do it, but I think it's like, you know, they say when, you know, a mother has its baby trapped under a car and there's this adrenaline that makes them lift up the car. Like, I think I somehow manifested the energy to get me through the day just because I loved the environment I was in. And, like, suddenly I was surrounded by brilliant pastry chefs creating the most beautiful goods for the counter. And, like, I'd start at 5:30 in the morning and they'd slowly, like, bring all of the products as they were ready up to the counter, and it was my job to arrange them and then sell them to the customers. And I loved the job. The only thing I didn't love was that I wasn't making what we were selling. And it was a good enough lesson to me that maybe this is something worth pursuing. So I ended up getting a job at a little cafe around the corner from my mum and dad's house, owned by this beautiful couple. And the woman was the chef, and her husband, Al, was a plumber, but he'd sort of put his career on hold to run the cafe with her, and he'd taught himself how to make coffee. And I'd go in there for my coffee, and I built up the courage one day to ask Mary if I could work for her. And she took me on part-time 4 hours every morning to come in and do all the baking for her. And, like, I still to this day can't believe the amount of trust that she put in me, like someone that had no experience professionally.
Yeah.
And to this day, that I think I spent about 2 years with her, and to this day that experience, it gave me the love and respect for food and ingredients that I have now. And it really built my foundation in hospitality. I learnt what hospitality means from this woman. So
that 2 years, you know, that was like your apprenticeship in a way with her.
Probably, yeah. So at some point during this 2 years, like I'd been sick for years, And I really hadn't been on a holiday. I hadn't been well enough. And traveling is one thing that I love. And I was starting to get a bit of an itch to travel again. Mm-hmm. And I bought a book that got delivered to Mum and Dad's house. And I came home from work one day and it had arrived. And I opened it. It was a book about Paris patisseries, like a coffee table book. Mm-hmm. And I opened it up randomly to this double-page photo of pain au chocolat. And it was zoomed in and like every layer was... you could see the integrity and perfection of every layer. It was like you could just bite into the page and you knew what it was going to taste like and sound like and smell like, everything. And I closed the book and I walked up to Camberwell Flight Centre and booked myself a ticket to Paris. So I went into work the next day and I told Mary what I'd done, and she's like, oh my God, can I come with you? And I think she'd never been to Paris at this stage. So after work that day, we went up to Flight Centre and booked her ticket. And then for a few weeks, Al went really quiet. And eventually we were like, Al, what's going on? He said, well, no one asked if I want to come to Paris. So he booked, and that September, the three of us headed off to Paris for a week. And then we were going to travel around France for 3 weeks after that. Mm-hmm. But the last day we were in Paris, Mary and Al, like, bless them, like, they were Mary's probably, she was the age that I am now, like late 30s. And she said to me really politely this morning, hey, do you mind if Al and I just have a day to ourselves in Paris? I'm like, please, like, we're in the most romantic city in the world, go for it. And I thought, maybe I might see if I can find the bakery where that photo was taken that made me book the trip.
Yep.
So I march across to the other side of Paris and I show up at this beautiful, like, fully restored Belle Epoque bakery, sort of on one of those sharp corners, the Haussmann-style architecture. Mm-hmm. And go inside and, like, there are the pain au chocolat that were in the photo, but then there's, a myriad of other pastries and breads lined up on this stunning counter. And the shop assistant was laughing at me. I think my chin must have hit the ground.
Just staring off into the distance.
Yeah. And I tried to...
Who's this weirdo that's just like...
Yeah, exactly. Are you going to buy anything? Yeah. So I tried to explain in broken French that I'd seen the photo and it made me book a trip to Paris. And she said, I don't speak much English. Apparently I don't either, sorry. And she went and got the owner, who had actually lived in Australia and America for a while and spoke fluent. Mm-hmm. So he came out and I told him the story, and he starts running around the bakery wrapping up pastries to give me, and he refused to take money. He said, it's an amazing story. I can't believe here you are. So I went and sat on the steps at Sacre-Cœur and, tried each of the pastries. And the next day, Mary and Al and I caught a train down to the south of France. And when we arrived at our hotel, and, like, this is how long ago this was, like, I didn't have a smartphone with email. Mm-hmm. The hotel had an internet room, so one computer where you could log on to the internet and check your email. So I went down and I decided I was going to email the owner and thank him for the pastries. I said, I haven't been able to stop thinking about the bakery. I don't suppose you'd ever take an apprentice. And he wrote back within the hour and said, look, I normally wouldn't. You don't speak French. We're a very small bakery. We only have French-speaking people here. But for some reason, I can see the same passion in you that was in me when I wanted to get into this industry. So when do you want to start?
That's incredible.
Yeah. So 6 months later, I was back on a plane to Paris to go and work in this perfect boulangerie in the 10th arrondissement in Paris.
Did you work on your French when you were back in Australia, like prepping for it?
A little bit. Yeah. Like, kind of bakery things like ingredients and numbers, because, like, being able to understand recipe and instruction and equipment. And my French did get pretty good when I was working at the bakery. I actually was only at the bakery in the end for a really short time. So I staged for a month. And then
staged?
Yeah, so staging is working for free.
Okay.
Typically, Michelin-starred restaurants will take stagiaires. So it's learning in return for work. Right. So what your payment is that you're getting experience with the best chefs in the world. So I staged at the boulangerie for a month, and then he had spoken to me about doing the full apprenticeship, which would have been learning everything to do with the bakery, so all of the bread as well. So for the first month, I just exclusively worked in the raw pastry kitchen where the viennoiserie were made, and croissant falls under the family of viennoiserie, and that was one of their specialties. So the cafe that I was working at the time in Melbourne, I'd gotten a job at 3 Bags Full in Abbotsford, which was opened by Nathan Tolman, who is now one of my business partners. Mm-hmm. He contacted me and said, we're expanding 3 Bags Full. Is there any chance you'd be able to come back? We need another pastry chef here. And I don't remember still what made me make the decision to leave Paris and not do the full apprenticeship, but I think it's always nice to be needed. And like working for Nathan was just wonderful. Like him and his wife Sarah are still to this day some of the best hospitality business people I've ever met, and I was honoured that he'd asked me to come back. So I thought, look, I've learned a fair bit at this bakery. I know how to make croissants now. Great. So I came back to work in Melbourne after the month in Paris, and I just desperately wanted to relive my days in Paris. So on all my days off, I'd travel around to cafes around Melbourne or bakeries, thinking today's going to be the day. They'll make the croissants as good as I know they can be. And every single bakery that I visited, I was just let down every time. And I started to think, like, Melbourne has the most amazing coffee scene, like probably the best in the world. All I want is an amazing Melbourne coffee and a perfect croissant to go with it.
I mean, at this stage, had you already perfected your own croissant?
No, God, no. Like, a whole lot of learning was still to come.
Right.
So I started this seed of an idea, like maybe I could start a little business that just specialises in croissants, and I could supply them to the best espresso bars around Melbourne. So, you know, someone like me can walk in and get a coffee and a pastry and have that perfect experience that I was having when I was in Paris. So I find a little site eventually, and I gather up all my life savings and spend them on, you know, the prover and the oven and a laminator and a bench and all the equipment that I need to make croissants, which I've done a bit of research, but I also remembered from the bakery in Paris. And then one of the jobs that I'd had in Paris was to make the dough, the croissant dough. And when I was making it, I was already thinking, like when I was making it in Paris, I was already thinking, oh, if this was my dough, I'd probably do this differently and maybe try this and that. So I still remember to this day, the first space that Lune had was down in Elwood. And I'm standing down there by myself, and I've made the dough the way I thought I would have changed it in Paris. And I tip it out on the bench, and I look at it, and I'm like, oh my God, I don't know what to do next. So it had been my job to make the dough, and then I'd eventually convinced the head pastry chef to let me roll croissants. But there are so many steps between making the dough and rolling the croissants, and I realised I didn't know how to do any of them. And at that point in time, I had a fully kitted out bakery around me. I just had this thought that I'm an intelligent woman, I'm an engineer. Think about that perfect end product that you want, and now you're going to have to reverse engineer it and come up with the technique yourself.
Wow.
So I didn't go to school, or I didn't get an apprenticeship, and I really, to this day, I still don't really know how to use YouTube, which is really embarrassing. So I kind of just did engineering testing.
Just testing over and over?
And I changed one variable every day, because if you change more than one, you don't know what's making the difference.
I mean, but what was that initial? Because you talked about the you changed a few things to do with the dough before you got into the rolling. But where did those changes kind of come from? Like you said, was it just like a...
It was more ingredient-based.
Okay, ingredient-based,
So some of the ingredients that we were using in Paris, and obviously it wasn't my bakery, so I was... it was my job to recreate their recipe. And I'm sure I have pastry chefs at Lune now that look at our recipe and go, oh, maybe if this was my business, I'd do it like this. But it wasn't my place to question that recipe, but I knew that some of the ingredients that they were using were, if I was making the croissant dough, I wouldn't use that. And so I was already sort of thinking in my mind, I'd probably substitute this for this, and I might want the pastry to be a bit looser, or... So I was already thinking that in Paris, and I started to implement that when I obviously set up everything at Lune.
Yeah.
So the dough recipe that we have here now is still to this day the same recipe that I developed 9 years ago.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then, so now you're testing.
Yep.
And how long did that kind of process go for?
The initial testing before I took a croissant out to the market was about 3 months.
Okay.
So just every day.
Every day.
Yep. And I knew how we'd done it in Paris, and it really made me start to question some of the techniques that were being used in Paris at the bakery, because the more I got to know the product, the more I started to see the idiosyncrasies and understand how the ingredients worked and the effect on things like time, temperature, and humidity. And I really started to feel like that was my engineering background coming into play. So to this day, the techniques that we use to make the croissant pastry and then even how we prove and bake it are very different to any other bakery, because this testing process that I went through showed me that I could get a far greater product doing something very different to the way that classically croissants are made.
Yeah, right.
So, yeah.
So in terms, sitting behind you right now is like this, what do you call it? Like the
cube?
The cube.
Yep.
So you're saying it's one thing to get the recipe perfected, but it's also about getting the environment perfected as well that recipe's made in?
The croissant dough in particular, or croissant or puff, is so, it's so critical, the environment that you work it in. So, croissant pastry, when it's, the one that's down on the bench at the moment, rolled flat, that final sheet that we shape the pastries from, that's 3 millimeters thick. And that has multiple layers of dough and butter through it. So thinking, those layers of dough and butter are fractions of a millimeter thick. If you cut a really, really thin slice of butter, think about how quickly that'll melt. And if this environment is warm in here, that butter will melt immediately, and you lose the ability to have those particles of water that are suspended in solid butter creating steam to push the layers apart, which is how you end up with a really light, fluffy, open croissant with an open honeycomb structure in the middle.
Yeah.
So I can taste, if I have somebody else's croissant now, I know if they've worked it on a bench that's too hot or in a room that's too hot, or if they've proven at too high a temperature, because it's often quite stodgy and doughy, and it's greasy on the outside because the butter has melted out before it's hit the oven. But if you can keep the butter solid until the second it hits the oven kind of forms a shell around it to encapsulate the butter. Kind of
protects it in a way.
Yeah, and it's not, I think you'll agree, it's not greasy or buttery. No. But it tastes super buttery, but somehow it doesn't leave a greasy film in your mouth. So, and it's just, rather than the butter melting out and you missing out on that opportunity to eat the butter and taste it, it's all captured in it.
It's extraordinary. Just the down to every single detail. So what's the temperature inside the cube kept at?
18 degrees.
18 degrees Celsius. Yep. And then is the bench cooled as well?
Yep.
That's at the same temperature or slightly lower, or?
No, I don't actually know exactly what temperature the bench is kept at, but we chill it the same way every day. So because the room is kept at the same temperature and the way we chill the bench is the same every day, it's consistent.
Yep.
It's just much colder than the pastry. So it doesn't encourage any melting of the butter. The other thing that's more challenging about croissant pastry compared to puff is croissant pastry is yeasted. So anything at room temperature will start to prove that pastry. And because with croissant you have to pull the dough out of the fridge multiple times during the layering process to create the layers, and then when you roll it out and shape it, every time it comes to room temperature, that's giving the yeast an opportunity to activate, which is minimising what it can achieve when it hits the oven.
Got it,
so the cooler you can keep it, the more active the yeast will be the second that pastry hits the oven.
And then throughout your testing process, I should ask, how many days start to finish are we talking about to create this dough?
3 days.
3 days?
Yep. So day one, we make the dough. And it then rests cooled for 24 hours to develop the complexity of flavour. Day two is where the majority of the work happens, where we flatten the dough, incorporate the butter and create all the layers, roll it out flat, shape the finished pastry, and then at the end of the day it goes in what's called a prover, which activates the yeast in it based on a specific temperature and humidity, and then it proves ready for baking on the third day.
And at the end of the testing process, do you remember the day where you're like, all right, I've got it, I've done it?
I don't remember the exact day, but I knew when I was getting close.
Yeah.
And I think probably because I am who I am, I probably repeated that final one a few days just to make sure it wasn't a fluke, which is just smart.
Yep.
I do still remember the first business that I took the pastries out to, and they actually rejected them and said, we don't want them.
Wow. I was going to say, did you get any flashbacks of that first go-kart race where you're taking them out to the market and you're like, holy shit,
Well, I was lucky because at the same time that I was ready to start supplying, my brother had opened up a cafe in Port Melbourne, and I'd pretty much cornered him into using my pastry.
Yeah,
so
it's a given. You're taking my stuff. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. No, you're not using that bakery. You're using mine. And then I don't know how they heard about me, but a new bakery had opened up in St Kilda at the time, and they were doing bread, but they didn't have a pastry kitchen set up. So the owner had approached me and said, do you mind supplying our pastries to us? So I had 2 clients. And then with confidence, I went out to this, like, I guess it was my marquee customer that I thought would be perfect to have Lune's pastries. I took them out of box, and they contacted me and said that they didn't want to use them, and I think that they said that my price point was too high as well.
So purely based off cost, it wasn't. They weren't even focusing on the actual.
No, it wasn't purely. I don't remember the exact feedback they gave me, but I know the pastries that they were using. I'm obviously not mentioning any names here, but I know the pastries they were using, and I know mine were far superior to it. But I'm assuming it had something to do with cost as well. And I do know that months later they got back in touch with me, and I think had forgotten that I'd brought a sample, and they said, we'd be really interested in like having your pastries at our cafe. And I said, I'm really sorry, like I've got a full client list at the moment and I can't fit you in, which was kind of a nice moment. So now the pastries are getting out there. Yep.
Like they're in the market.
And I'm now like not taking boxes out anymore. Now people, and I will name them because the number one customer that I wanted was this cafe called Patricia in the CBD. And they're just like, they were famous for doing everything the best. And I was like, when Patricia want my croissants, I've made it.
Right.
And I started supplying customers in the October of 2012. And just before Christmas, Bowen, who owned Patricia, got in touch with me and said, hey, I remember getting the email this particular night still saying, hey, I've heard about your pastries. I'd love to get a sample box in. I think they could work really well at Patricia, and me doing a little happy dance that night. So I started supplying Patricia with the pastries early the next year, and it really kicked off then. Like once they were in Patricia, a whole lot of people wanted them, and I got to the point where I had to start saying no to people because as one person, I'd reached my capacity of what I could produce. But at this point in time, I was working 90 to 100 hours a week. I didn't have a day off because I was supplying 7 days a week, and I was like literally working myself into the ground.
Yeah.
But again, you find that energy and motivation through I loved it. Like, although I was working incredibly hard, it was very satisfying, and I loved the pastry production side. But then I was doing the deliveries, the invoicing, the accounts, ordering, everything was down to me.
Was this all? So this was all just on your own at this stage?
Yes, with some support from mum and dad. Like,
okay.
Dad would come down in the mornings when I was sort of ready to take off on my deliveries, and I'd come back and bless him, the kitchen was clean. Dad.
Thanks, Dad.
Yeah, thanks, Dad. And then mum would often come down after work in the afternoons and start to help me with... I was also doing some slices and granola bars and stuff for a couple of cafes. So mum would crack on with that while I focused on the pastries. So
yep.
I did have support from those two. But apart from that, I didn't have staff members. Anyway, I was probably about a year in and very burnt out. And I shut the business down for 2 weeks and went to Paris on holiday. And I came back, I went to the Wheeler Centre to hear Reid Redzepi talk about the journal that he just released about the worst year of his life being the year that he was voted best restaurant in the world, because it changed the type of pressure that was on him, and it created quite a negative environment in the kitchen because no one that was working there, including him, was doing it for themselves anymore. They were doing it to like meet expectations of people that had heard about this restaurant because of the publicity it had received. And although it was like a much smaller scale, I'd started to feel a bit the same, like I'm delivering these wholesale pastries, I'm not getting to see the customers enjoy them, and I'm just baking purely to people's orders, not like I was missing a bit of creative control of, like I'd started to have all these ideas of what I wanted to do with croissant pastry, but all people wanted was like the ham and Gruyere and the rhubarb Danish and the plain croissant and the almond. And like I was like, I want to do crazy flavours. I want to do interesting stuff with this amazing pastry I'm working with. So my brother had sold his cafe and was looking for his next opportunity. And I left this talk with Reid Redzepi, and I called Cam and I'm like, while you're looking for your next opportunity, do you want to come on board? I'm thinking about turning Lune into a little retail space where I just sell pastries direct to the public. And he's like, yeah, that sounds good. I'll come down and help you. So I think we opened to the public in December 2013. We just converted the door of the little bakery down at Elwood into a barn door.
Yep.
And sold over the barn door. And within weeks, like I remember the first day we had a really long line was Australia Day 2013, and there was a line going around the block. But we were already having people show up an hour or two before we were going to open to make sure that they were
an hour or two.
Yeah.
Wow.
So within 2 or 3 months, people were showing up at 4 and 5 in the morning. And we'd open the little espresso window at 6:30 and start giving out raffle tickets for like people who were in the line, and there'd be 100 people around the block. And it was
unbelievable.
We were selling out within an hour of opening, and we just could not meet demand. And enter Nathan Tolman. He invited us to the opening of Kettle Black Cafe in Albert Park, and we said to him, Nathan, like, demand is far outweighing supply at the moment. We probably need to look for a bigger space. You get offered spaces all the time. If you come across one that you don't think is appropriate for your business, or an idea that you have and you think it might work for Lune, is there any chance you can keep us in mind? He's like, oh, it's funny you say that. And he handed us the keys to 119 Rose Street, Fitzroy, and said, I've had the lease on this for 6 months, but I'm not quite sure what to do with it. Why don't you go and have a look? So Cam and I came to this incredible building after work one night and stood in 400 square metres of an empty heritage-listed building in Fitzroy and thought, well, it's like way bigger than we need, but how amazing would this be?
It seems like you've had some incredibly, like, just the timing of some of the things along your journey just been like serendipitous in a way. It's
totally.
It's extraordinary.
Yeah, like we didn't look at one other space to move Lune into. This was the one.
Yeah.
And then Nathan took us out to dinner at the Town Mouse, which was my favourite restaurant at the time, and proposed to us that he come in as a business partner and that he wanted to help us grow Lune. And it's just been the three of us ever since. So, yeah, it's been an incredible journey.
So, Kate, when it comes to having a following on Instagram and getting a bit of news in the press, has there been a time where things really did change and things kind of were upped?
Yeah, 100%. There was a huge turning point back in 2016. So a year before that, a friend of mine would come and sit next to me when I baked up down in Elwood, and I'd give him one fresh pastry out of the oven because that's all we had to spare. And he calls me up this one day and says, hey, do you mind if me and a friend come and sit on the step next to you while you bake? I said, yeah, that's fine, but you can only have one each. And anyway, they came and sat on the step, and it was only afterwards that I realised that the friend he'd brought down was a journalist from the New York Times who went back to the States and told his editor that Lune was one of the most special experiences he'd had while he was in Melbourne. And the editor said, great, let's write a story about them. So 6 months after Oliver Strand visited Australia and Lune, he wrote a piece in the New York Times stating that Lune was the best croissant in the world, which is
unbelievable.
Powerful media. And it was funny, like, from that story cascaded so many stories about that story. So The Guardian in London wanted to write about the New York Times piece stating this, and Le Monde in France wanted to write about the New York Times piece stating this. So much media was generated from that. I still remember the day after that story went live, the line just went like around the block twice. It was definitely a stepping stone or an important pivotal moment in Lune in terms of us getting global attention. And
it's huge.
Yeah,
I mean, just the statement alone is massive. I mean, I'm curious, has there been like, especially anyone from France be like, oh, best in the world, like, bullshit, like ours is the best in the world? Like, is there any rivalries from the home country?
Oh, 100%. But one of my favourite stories is, I believe the chef's name is Pierre Kaufmann, and I'm going to fact check that for you, but very famous French chef who came out for the world's 50 best when they were hosted in Melbourne a few years ago. And Melbourne Food and Wine Festival arranged to bring him in. And I still remember him coming in and like looking around. I'm not going to attempt the French accent, but just looking around going, oh my God, who are these hipster Australians thinking they can make a croissant? Anyway, I saw one of the staff bring him out a croissant. He was sitting up where we're sitting now. And nobody's allowed in the cube, the glass room behind me, from the public. But I just remember him walking around the bench, opening the door, letting himself in, coming and grabbing me by the shoulders and giving me kisses on both cheeks, saying, oh my God, you've just taken me back to my childhood. That was so light and fluffy and buttery and crunchy and cloudy that was amazing. Thank you so much. And it's funny, like I'm always so honoured when someone tells me how amazing the pastry is. But when it's not only a French person but a French chef, I feel so validated.
That's the ultimate.
It's the ultimate.
That's unbelievable.
Yep. So I'm pretty sure there have been many a French person scoff at the idea of the best croissant in the world coming from Australia. But again, going back to it, it's a very subjective thing. So, yep. I'm just happy that Oliver thought so and decided to tell the world about it.
Awesome. And I mean, you know, the more we've been talking here, like there is a bit of a line starting to form, but you've now got how many? There's a location in the CBD in Melbourne.
Yep. So it's a satellite store. So all the raw production's done in Fitzroy.
Yep.
And every day we drive the raw product into the city, but we prove and bake fresh in the city because the point of difference of Lune is that whatever time of day you walk in, there'll be fresh croissants out of the oven because there is nothing quite like eating a croissant that's still warm. And most bakeries don't offer that experience. So we've got the CBD satellite store. In 2 months' time, we're going to be opening up in Brisbane.
Oh, wow.
In
Excellent.
a store that is overall similar size to Fitzroy, but the retail space is separate to the production space. So we'll have a very different feel to what we're sitting in now, but there'll still be some jaw-dropping aspect to it in terms of how we fit it out, and the customer experience will still be very similar. We are also working on a space in Sydney, which we hope to open in the first half of next year, and then potentially looking further abroad than that.
Oh, wow. Interesting. Okay.
And we're also getting ready to open a brand new business, hopefully at the end of next week, just down the road.
What does that involve, that one?
So it's, again, just focusing on perfecting one product that's not widely known about in Australia. I'm super excited about it. It's my favourite thing that I eat when I'm in New York, and I haven't experienced anything like it in Melbourne.
Oh, we're talking about bagels?
No, actually a product called a cruller.
A cruller?
Yep, which is deep fried choux pastry that's glazed. So it's like a donut.
Oh, wow, okay.
But the eating experience is quite different. It's got a beautiful crust on it, but it's almost custard-like on the inside, kind of like a canale.
Okay, yeah.
But much more tender than a canale, so which is quite caramelized and chewy.
Nice.
So it's going to be called Moon, and that's opening hopefully end of next week.
Awesome.
All going to plan with building, which, as I'm sure you know, can blow out very easily.
I mean, quick one for you about the croissant. Is there ever been a traditional way to actually eat them? Is it always just on its own and that's it? Because like when I was growing up, I would chop into one and put some butter in and put some jam in, and like that was like that was the way I'd just love to do it. But like and I'm talking like if you're in Paris, is there a specific way? Like would they frown upon ways they might be eaten here, or is it just?
It's an interesting question. I think probably in France the traditional way to eat it is as it is. But if you walk into any little bar or cafe and there's croissants on the counter, it'll probably be delivered out to you with some jam on the side.
Yeah.
I think I personally have zero judgment on how anyone wants to eat it. Like, it's like a steak. If you want it rare all the way through to well done, that's a personal preference thing. For me, the traditional croissant, I'll pretty much just eat it as it is. But on Christmas Day, I will cut it in half and fill it with raspberry jam and whipped cream. And it's indulgent. It's a once a year type affair, but it's pretty special.
That's a great idea.
Maybe the French would frown on that. Who knows?
I've got a friend of mine who likes his chocolate croissant, but he cuts his open and then spreads in a ridiculous amount of Nutella.
Oh my God! So chocolate on chocolate.
Yeah, just like doubles down in a big way. It's kind of sickening when I watch him eat it, but it's each to their own.
Each to their own. I think for me, a pain au chocolat, the thing that I love about it is that there isn't much chocolate in it. Like, it's so French. It's that idea, again, of everything in moderation. Like, these 2 batons of, like, beautiful, bitter, dark chocolate just offsetting the butteriness of the croissant. For me, it's the perfect amount. But, again, that's my perfect amount, not everyone's.
Where do you get the chocolate for your chocolate croissants?
We get that. I believe it's a French chocolate. So we have been contacted by local producers, but there's something about the melting of it that doesn't quite work yet. So again, at Lune, because we bake fresh throughout the day, most pain au chocolat that you would order here, the chocolate is still melted on the inside. It hasn't reset as a baton. Much so that I was baking up in the city about a year ago, and a woman came up and said, "Oh, don't you use chocolate batons. Have you put ganache in the middle of that? And I said, no. And she went, well, why is it soft like that? And I said, because it's melted and it's just out of the oven.
It's the way it's meant to be.
Exactly. Yeah, it's special. It's like people just aren't used to it.
Well, this has been fantastic to hear this. You've had quite the journey. It seems like Lune has a few things on the horizon which are going to be really exciting.
I think the thing for us is we only ever take the next step when we're really confident with what we've done prior and we know it's consolidated and we feel like we've got the resource to reach further. And I feel like we've got a lot more resource left in us. And obviously we've got Brisbane and Sydney coming up, which will challenge us a lot. And we'll learn a lot of lessons from that. And potentially after opening Sydney, we might think that's enough. But if I don't feel like Lune has reached its ceiling, and I know Cameron and Nathan agree with me, I don't see why we wouldn't see where the business can go from there. As long as we maintain the integrity of the business and the reputation and the quality of the product, I'm happy to see it keep growing.
Awesome.
Yeah.
All right, Kate. Well, thank you very much.
Pleasure.
This has been fantastic. And I'm going to finish my croissant now, actually, because I've only had half of it. So
you've been very well behaved.
I know, I'm just very patient. Let's wrap this up so I can finish this.
Yeah. Nice to meet you, Nick.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thanks.
Hey everyone, just wanted to say a big thank you for all the support here at the Dish Pig. We really appreciate it. By we, I mean me. So remember, you can follow us on Instagram at _dish_pig. Subscribe wherever you listen to your podcasts. Tell your family, tell your friends, tell your accountant, tell your lawyer, tell your barber. Tell your bartender, tell your waiter, tell anyone. Share the love. I'll see you next time.